Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is our last 2024 webinar of the Insight Sustainability series and is a result of the cooperation between the DRBF Offshore Task Force and the World Forum Offshore Wind. I am Georgiana Takuc, President of the DRBF Board of Directors Region 2, comprising Africa, Asia, Europe, and the MENA region, and I am your host for today. For those of you new to DRBF, the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation was established in the 1996 by the creators of the dispute board process with a mission to develop dispute avoidance and effective resolution for construction projects. Today, the association has over 1,400 members in over 70 countries, and DRBF develops best practices and offers training and educational resources for project owners, contractors, and DB practitioners, but it also partners with other industry organizations to adapt the DB process to new sectors, such as offshore wind. It may be of interest to note that DRBF is publishing a guide to best practices and procedures, the DB manual, now available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Our topic today is dispute boards for multiple contract offshore wind projects, models for success. We will look at the specific of the offshore wind industry and the constraints and challenges that dispute boards meet within in this industry. We will learn what other projects in other industries have done when they dealt with multiple contracts, their lessons learned, sort of say, and we'll discuss what type of DB arrangements and provisions are suitable for the offshore wind industry from our speakers today. And alphabetically, Arend von Wassenaar spent 33 years in private practice with Huthoff, Norton, Rose Fulbright, and Allen and Overy Sherman in Amsterdam. Since 2016, he flies under the wings of the Faithful Goose in The Hague in the Netherlands. And his work focuses on dispute avoidance and dispute resolution as a mediator, DAB member, arbitrator, and deputy judge in several courts of appeal. Arend is married, has 3 kids, 3 stepkids, 5 grandchildren, and 2 dogs. Jaron Monahan is a chartered engineer with some 30 years experience in the delivery of major construction projects in Ireland and internationally, with a particular focus on energy and renewables. He's an experienced ADR professional and is appointed regularly as arbitrator, adjudicator, mediator, conciliator, and dispute board member. He is a FIDIC certified adjudicator, a member of the FIDIC President list of approved dispute adjudicators, and the current chairman of the Engineers Island Disputes Resolution Board, but also a former chairman of the Irish branch of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrator, and is the DRBF country representative for Ireland. Murray Arms is the founder of Arms ADR and has 40 years experience in the industry, working on many types of construction projects around the world, and is a practicing arbitrator, DAB member on the FIDIC President lists, adjudicator, and mediator. He's a past president for Region 2 of the DRBF, which was much larger at the time, comprising Latin America as well, and is a member of the Society of Construction Law Council. Recent DABs include the ITER prototype fusion energy project in France, reputedly the world's largest energy project, the new high luminosity project and a new data center both for CERN in Switzerland, as well as an EPR nuclear project in Ghana and an innovative building project in Iraq, but also DABs for projects in the Caribbean, Central Asia, and Far East. Tom Smith is a partner in the International Arbitration, Construction and Engineering team at Hogan Lovells in London, advising clients on contentious issues arising out of the operations across the world. Tom has represented clients working on offshore wind projects across UK, Europe, and Asia. This includes DAB references, arbitrations, and litigation concerning almost every aspect of offshore wind infrastructure, including foundations, monopiles and transition pieces, wind turbine generators, turbine blades, inter-array cables, offshore and onshore substations, SCADA, and installation vessels. He has particular experience in handling complex delayed cases arising from these projects, acting for both employers and contractors. And Nicholas Rigby, who needs no introduction, he's the co-chair of the DRBF Offshore Wind Task Force, and we're going to commemorate this webinar today. And now I would like to invite Jerry to start walking us through the multi-contracts in offshore wind industry. Jerry, if you please.
Thank you, Georgiana, and good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be. Good evening, perhaps, to all our attendees for today's webinar. My name is Jerry Monaghan. What I would like to do, as Georgiana has mentioned, is really to introduce the topic of multiple contract DAB provisions for offshore wind projects, why they're useful, how they might be configured, and the challenge of getting them configured and aligned properly. My fellow panelists then will continue and put some flesh in the bones, so to speak, as to how it might be achieved. So I might just share my screen. Hopefully it'll work with the slides. You'll see that, I think. Yeah. So, second, get it going. Offshore wind projects, by their nature, and I'm kind of stating the obvious here, they're very challenging projects to deliver. They're both technically challenging and contractually challenging. Technically, in terms of you're obviously in a marine environment, a maritime environment, with weather impacts, with salt water, with access difficulties, with vessel hire, maritime issues generally. You've grid connections, you have onshore and offshore converters and the like, ground conditions. So very, very challenging technically. But equally, and no less importantly, the contractual matrix surrounding the delivery of offshore wind projects can be complex. So typically, rather than one single EPC contractor, you have typically 4 or 5 major contractors on site with their subcontractors, etc., delivering the project and building out the project. So that brings a degree of contractual complexity to the issue. There's no, as far as I'm aware, industry specific, so offshore wind industry specific contractual mechanism for providing an effective dispute board process in and of itself. And the construction industry generally, and the offshore wind infrastructure delivery model or process really introduces new or additional stakeholders or influencers into the mix for delivery. And the issues around those particular aspects of delivery are not typically catered for in your standard construction contracts, be it NEC or FIDIC and the like that we're all familiar with. Equally, the standard forms of contracts are not typically drafted with offshore wind projects in mind. Heavy equipment loaded projects where you've got vessel hire, you've got cranes, you've remote operated vehicles, ROVs on the seabed, you have special purpose equipment and the like. So it's very, very particular infrastructure and plant that is needed for such projects that are not typically catered for in our standard forms of contract. And in addition to the general contractual provision, there may be maritime law issues to deal with. So that kind of sets out a little bit about the complexity of an offshore wind project in terms of a dispute board. Where then do the potential dispute flashpoints tend to arise, in my experience? So, technology is evolving at a rapid pace. So you're involved really in the delivery and installation, commissioning and operation of new technologies, new processes on a regular basis with new standards, consent standards associated with it. With the 4 or 5 major contractors involved in the delivery of such an offshore wind project and the multiple subcontractors thereby associated with it, you have real sequencing and planning issues around the major operations. We've learned in previous webinars and from work experience generally that for the larger wind turbine installations offshore wind, the size of the vessel, the ship that's needed to deliver that to the site for installation can be a huge daily cost, up to the order of 400,000 or 500,000 euros per day. So clearly, any delays or issues that could arise there could very quickly escalate into a very, very significant number. So it's a real pressure point. It's a real dispute flashpoint. You have the integration of onshore and offshore elements, the turbines itself, the wind farm itself, the grid, the converters, and the onshore equipment. And you've the transmission system interface. So really, I'm making the point that it's at the interface between the various components of an offshore wind project where disputes typically tend to arise. And by their nature, the projects are typically large, so the resultant time and cost impacts in particular can be equally significant and of real issues to all concerned. So there's a real need for dispute avoidance and dispute management process by way of a dispute board to be incorporated. The graphic there kind of shows that the various typical scale. You have the wind farm itself. You have the offshore converter converting from AC to DC current. You have the transmission, the grid. You have the onshore converter again reconverting it back, and you have the grid substation. So very, very significant elements in complex, challenging environments. So the DRBF have published extensive data setting out the benefits of dispute boards generally in terms of dispute avoidance and efficient dispute management. A number of institutions have their own dispute board rules and procedures. The ICC, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and FIDIC. And FIDIC perhaps are the best known, and to my mind, the most efficient and best structured dispute board provisions. In the FIDIC 2017 suites, it's referred to as the DAAB, so this is Dispute Avoidance and Adjudication Board. So there's the twin track approach there in terms of dispute avoidance and adjudication. And Rule 1 of the FIDIC DAB procedure rules sets out these objectives in order to A, facilitate the avoidance of disputes that might otherwise arise between the parties, and B, to achieve the expeditious, efficient, and cost-effective resolution of any dispute that arises between the parties. So the benefits of dispute boards are there to be seen in terms of dispute avoidance and efficient dispute management where the dispute can't be avoided. So if the informal assistance at site level or otherwise informal opinions that are given by the dispute board don't serve to actually avoid to make sure that this dispute doesn't actually arise, there's equally then an efficient and clear process whereby the dispute can be resolved by way of decision of the dispute board. So then in the context of today's webinar, the ask really is, we've seen that it's very technically challenging projects, offshore wind projects. B, a complex contractual matrix surrounding delivery. We've also seen, set out the real benefits of dispute boards generally to project delivery. So the ask and the topic we're considering today is how, with that kind of background, technically challenging multiple contracts, how we could incorporate a multi-contract dispute board provision in, whereby the dispute board that's established at commencement could have oversight across a multitude of contracts and be able to act efficiently in terms of dispute avoidance for the project generally, for the project sponsors, and have that kind of knowledge, oversight, and insight that they could react quickly towards dispute avoidance and/or efficient dispute resolution if a dispute manifests itself in due course. So the ask is, as I said, interface issues due to multiple contracts, multiple contract forms, multiple dispute provisions and timelines. So each contract that might be there on a site will have their own individual dispute provisions, be it mediation, be it arbitration, adjudication. They may or may not have a dispute board mandated within the contractual provision. So there's a multitude of dispute management techniques in the contracts that are typically used, and timelines, all running at different timelines in and of themselves. So typically there's no oversight generally from a single dispute board or panel. And the question we're asking today in this webinar, and we hope the DRBF and the WFO hope it's a start of a process, is there a model for aligning or creating dispute board clauses across multiple contracts for delivery of particular offshore wind projects in order that the clear and obvious benefits of the dispute board can be accrued on a project basis across the entirety of the project itself? There are, of course, legal constraints or challenges generally around such a model. And I've set a few of them out here in the current slide. Timelines. So the decision-making timelines and processes that are in the individual contracts can vary. They can run in parallel, they can run in sequence or a mixture, and there's different timelines for decisions to be made, all of which need to be observed by both parties to the individual contracts in order to preserve entitlement. So timelines are very important, but they can vary from contract to contract. The diversity of parties and confidentiality, that goes without saying. Be it civil engineering, mechanical, electrical, commissioning, turbine supply, marine vessel hire, etc. There's a huge diversity of interests, diversity of parties, diversity of technologies, and each contract, there's confidentiality issues around each contract. A dispute board, a DAB, a dispute board established under one particular contract has no authority to expand their jurisdiction. So they cannot involve themselves in a parallel contract or otherwise unless the parties agree to that. There may be issues around related and non-related claims with subcontractors, but by and large, if they have no authority to expand their jurisdiction unilaterally unless they can achieve agreement from the contracting parties themselves. Equally, they have no authority to expand the scope of services to other matters. They have no authority to expand the procedural rules for the dispute. And privity of contract is a key factor. Each contract exists on its own merits, so that's a real issue. So there are a handful of constraints that would need to be considered in terms of delivering multiple contract DAB provisions. So where would we go with that? What might a solution look like? I'm certainly of the opinion, and I know the DRBF and the WFO are likewise minded that there is a need for the bespoke dispute avoidance and adjudication board provisions, dispute board clauses across the multiple contracts for the delivery of a particular project to be aligned. So that's what the objective is: multiple contract DAB to be aligned. There is some precedent for multi-party arbitration clauses and adjudication clauses, indeed, that have been developed by the LCIA, the London Court of International Arbitration, or the ICC in Paris. And the wording they're at and the template that they use could very well serve as a model for what we're trying to achieve here. We'll hear from Murray, Tom, and Arent about the existing models and hybrids that are currently operating in the model in the marketplace from mega projects elsewhere, be it power plants or otherwise. There are some common themes there in that a large DAB panel typically is established at commencement, be it 10 or 12 individuals typically of a major project. That panel is in situ for the duration of the project, from the design into the construction and into operation phase in some cases. So typically in situ for a period of 5 to 7 years. A chairman or convener is appointed at commencement, and he or she makes the appointments of a panel for dispute avoidance and dispute resolution across multiple contracts as and when the issue arises. But most importantly, the DAB, the dispute board provisions, are mandated, or they're imposed by the project owner or the project sponsor at commencement. So you can't really opt out of it. So you may have a number of contracts involved, but the DAB provisions are imposed. You can't get away from it. And the model is set up by the project sponsor, typically along this kind of arrangement with a large panel and a chairman and a convener who allocates adjudicators accordingly as the need arise, and it's based on the characteristics of the particular issue of the dispute that has arisen. So there are some common themes there, and my fellow panelists will speak about them further in the course of this webinar. Just to finish, really, and this will come up again in the Q&A. As I said, the DRBF Offshore Wind Task Force, in a consultation of the WFO, World Forum for Offshore Wind, and other interested parties, are in the process of considering appropriate wording and provisions for multi-contract, multi-party DABs, and we will welcome any feedback or comments constructively given towards that aim, either today in the Q&A or subsequent to the presentation itself. So that's really all for me at the moment. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand across to my colleague Murray Arms to pick up the reins here in terms of potential models. So Murray, I'll stop sharing here if I can, and I'll let you. share. Actually, Murray, is it? Yeah. I think you're muted, Murray, are you? Murray, you're muted, right? You're trying to unmute yourself.
Okay, is that better?
It is now, thank you.
You can hear me now. Okay, lovely, thank you. And hopefully you can see the slides too. Have I got, yeah, here we go. Okay, well, thank you, Jerry. Jerry's posed a few questions there for us. And I'm pleased to say I've been working on a project now for almost 12 years where a lot of those problems have actually been addressed. It's not an offshore wind project, it's a nuclear fusion project in southern France, firmly on dry land, but nonetheless, they've faced many of these problems that, or not problems, challenges that arise from multiple contracts. I've probably got far more slides here and far more material than I can go through line by line, but I believe these will be available to you to read later. So I'm going to sort of take sections of the slides as we go through. So the sort of features of offshore wind, I think Jerry covered multiple stakeholders, multiple contracts, multiple construction stages, and of course, challenging locations. Just a kind of brief introduction to dispute avoidance, I guess, and wind projects. You know, because of those parameters, is there a greater likelihood of disputes? Well, the answer is probably yes. Disputes, I think we would agree, arise out of uncertainty, and they give rise to risk, and risk is a sort of key component of disputes. I'm not going to read out the list of risks for onshore wind projects. I'm sure you have your own. There are all sorts of definitions of a dispute. My definition is that it evolves from a disagreement that impacts the commercial interest of one or other, or possibly both of the parties to a contractual arrangement. And I probably don't need to tell anybody on this webinar the benefits of dispute avoidance and of DABs. Traditionally, DABs comprise either a single member or maybe three or a greater odd number of members. I'm going to explain to you how a much larger panel can sometimes perhaps be helpful. Obviously, it's always important to ensure the right mix and scope of expertise. And in projects where you've got multiple different contract types, you may have civil engineering, you've got mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and so on. A larger panel enables you to cover those fields with a greater degree of expertise. So a larger panel has certain advantages because it gives you that wider depth of experience. And for the ITER project, for instance, we have 7 people on the panel. We have a combination of nuclear engineers, legal experts, a couple of architects, and we have quantum and delay as well. And depending on the issues that we face, the chairperson can select the 3 most suited to a dispute. Thankfully, in the time I've been on the project, we've only actually had 2 disputes referred in 12 years. So we've been working hard on the dispute avoidance side. Dispute avoidance is carried out by the entire panel on that project. So it's not a case of selecting 3. All of the panel members have input. Larger DAB, obviously higher cost, but it does give you a certain degree of flexibility. So for instance, if there is a meeting and only half the panel can actually make that meeting, then you have still got sufficient members to form a quorum and take the project forward. So let's just have a quick look at this ITER project. I don't know how many of you might have seen this. Everything I'm showing you is publicly available. And it is the world's first prototype large experimental nuclear fusion project. There's a Nobel laureate there who said that basically it's like putting the sun in the box, the sun in a box, and that's basically what this project does. It's a collaboration of 35 nations over a period of 35 years, and it started in 2007. And the members there you can see are from China, the EU, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, and the USA. So a lot of different cultures involved. I'm not going to explain nuclear fusion to you today, but you can see that 600 kilograms of nuclear fusion fuel is equivalent to 250,000 tons of oil or 40,000 tons of coal. The site itself, this is a computer-generated aerial view, is huge. 39 buildings on 42 hectares. The building in the middle there, this one here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, that goes about 50 meters underground and about 60 or 70 meters above ground. So it is absolutely enormous. Just to come back to the contracts and the challenges that the project faces, there are about 25 contracts that have been let so far. They're not all on site at exactly the same time, but quite a lot of them have been on site at the same time. They're let on the 1999 FIDIC red or yellow book, suitably modified. And there are also separate services contracts for the architect, engineer, and health and safety. So each construction contract has provision for resolution of disputes by the dispute board. So you can imagine with 25 packages, you have 25 separate contracts between Fusion for Energy, which is the European agency tasked with providing the civil works, and each of the joint venture contractors. And these contracts are huge. The small ones are tens of millions of euros, and the larger ones are hundreds of millions of euros. The total cost it's reported to be about 25 billion euros, but I suspect it's actually a lot higher than that now. So these contracts are truly enormous. And what connects the contracts and the contractors together are a series of interface agreements. So where an individual contract interfaces with another contract, there is an interface agreement that governs how the interface will work. And those interface agreements also have provisions for the dispute board to assist with both dispute avoidance and dispute resolution, in other words, making decisions. But you'll see as I go through the way the site visits and so on are set up, which is quite different to a normal dispute board. You'll see how each of those contracts interacts with each other. So I think I've probably covered most of this. Contracts are let to consortia of international contractors. Some of the construction techniques are literally first of a kind. And one of the problems that they had is that the novel technology and complex technology that is going into this building is actually developing at a faster rate than they can construct the civil work. So you can imagine what the change management issues are. So the dispute board in this case was convened in February 2014. We originally had 6 members, we now have 7. And although it's called an adjudication panel, it is a dispute board and works in exactly the same way, but the primary function is dispute avoidance. Now, just coming on to the way the DAB was appointed, due to public procurement constraints, Fusion for Energy could not enter into the normal tripartite arrangement that you would have where the dispute board member signs a contract both with the employer and the contractors. So as Jerry suggested, what has happened here is that we are exclusively employed by Fusion for Energy, and we as adjudicators are imposed by Fusion for Energy on the contractors. So the contractors have no say in the build-up of the panel. And I've listed there the expertise that we currently have. Now we have, up until a couple of years ago, we used to meet about every 4 months. It's now only every 12 months because the civil works are coming to an end, although there is still work that will go on probably for the next 6 or 7 years. So traditionally every 4 months, which is pretty much like any other dispute board. And the way it is structured is the visits include an overview and progress and key points, and meetings are held between Fusion for Energy and any contractors that wish to participate. Now, that might sound quite complicated, but the way we do it is we spend probably half a day on site. We are conducted round by Fusion for Energy, which is also acting as the engineer. And any of the contractors that want to join us in that physical site tour are welcome to do so. We then go back to the meeting room and we are given a presentation, an update by Fusion for Energy, to which any of the contractors are invited. In practice, just a few tend to attend both the walk around and the presentation by Fusion for Energy. When that's all over, we then have individual meetings between Fusion for Energy and any of the individual contracting entities that wants to meet with us. So it's not just a meeting, it's a whole series of meetings, which sometimes we're there for a day, sometimes we're there for 2 days. We have been there for 3 days, I think, on a couple of occasions, depending on the number of consortia that actually wants to meet with us. And the site visit report is quite challenging because you don't write one. You're writing an overall site visit for everybody, site visit report for everybody, and then you're writing individual site visit reports for the individual meetings. So they can be 6 or 7. Dispute resolution, similar, I suppose, to the FIDIC process. Engineer's determination triggers the dispute, crystallizes the dispute. There's then a referral to senior management, and there's a 28-day time bar for that. Outside the 28 days, you can't go there. They have 30 to 45 days to discuss, and it's extended. And if necessary, the dispute is referred to us. But we only get a fairly limited amount of time to actually do it. Technically, we get 25 days, although in practice, it has taken longer than that to do one of the more complicated ones. And rather than ICC arbitration, our decision is final and binding unless it is brought before the European Court in Luxembourg, which is quite an unusual method of dispute resolution. Whether or not that court has the expertise to decide such disputes hasn't been tested yet. So the 2 decisions that we made have been complied with. Just a few shots there of the project and how the DAB members are sort of dwarfed by the physical civil works of the project. The assembly building is, as I say, some 200 odd feet high inside there, and the yellow things are the 3 largest nuclear-rated cranes that have ever been constructed in the world. They are enormous. They're about 4 meters tall. That's the sun in a box. That is the tokamak reactor within the box that encloses it. The box is now there. They're building the actual tokamak reactor as we speak. And I'm going to leave you to read the slide for yourself. Is dispute avoidance worth it? Well, I think we all believe it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on the call. It saves us time and money and reputations. And it'd be nice to think that money can be helped to improve margins in what is a highly competitive industry. And with that, I'll hand over to who's coming next. Tom, I think you're coming next, aren't you?
Thank you, Murray.
Hang on. Do you want me to? Oh, hang on. You want me to stop sharing? Sorry.
No problem. I think you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, everything.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, look, what I was going to cover in my section here is titled Multi-Party DABs in Offshore Wind. How is this being done in practice? I mean, there's probably a decent argument to say I should have titled this "How is this not being done in practice?" But anyway, that's one of the things we're here today to discuss. Before I get into that, look, who am I? So I'm Tom Smith. We had a little introduction earlier, so I'll keep it short. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells here in London. I'm regularly instructed by employers and contractors on offshore wind projects, and regularly advising clients in offshore wind, but also in many other industries, in representations for DABs, whether that be kind of making the representations or behind the scenes helping to guide those. So look, we're all on the call for a reason. We all believe that the benefits of DABs are clear, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But anyway, let's just summarize what those are in the context of what we're talking about. So the idea is obviously that there is a kind of an efficient and consistent dispute avoidance and adjudication mechanism that is particularly important in offshore wind. As Jerry said at the top of the call, there are lots of parties interfacing in lots of different ways. And whereas back when the first kind of big North Sea projects were happening, you might have had that kind of single EPC contractor model. That does not exist anymore. The risks are simply too great. So we have a much more diverse way of contracting, which means that interfaces, the interface risk needs to be dealt with in a slightly different way. No single contractor is willing to swallow that risk. So in theory, for contractors and for subcontractors, it should speed up the payment and unlock disputes around withheld sums. And obviously for employers, the idea really in the offshore wind context, given the technology risk, is that it will provide early guidance on those kind of technical issues and defects, and it should ensure that the supply chain remains incentivized because of that kind of throughput of payments. Now, obviously, we need to balance that with the perennial employer position, which I'm sure you're all aware of, which is, well, hang about, if I'm the insurer, I'd much rather just keep this money in my pocket, and if they want it, they can start a big expensive arbitration at the end of the project. But anyways, well, I think we are part of the movement away from that, and we should keep our minds firmly focused on that. So in the context of offshore wind, why do we want to try and bind all parties to the same procedure, in this case for a DAB? Well, it gives consistency and transparency in the resolution of disputes which affect all these multiple packages. So it should be more efficient for all the parties on the project. It also removes the risk of inconsistent DAB decisions, and that is absolutely the enemy of proper allocation of project risk and project liabilities. And it should also reduce the need for complex and expensive arbitration proceedings later down the line, or simply of people having to swallow that risk and liability against their wishes because there is not an efficient and kind of value for money way of challenging the decisions of the employer. So how are we going to go about getting this kind of nice, consistent DAB process in place on an offshore wind project? Well, there's kind of three main ways of doing it. One, which is the really obvious point, as I say on the slide here, if you want this type of kind of common, consistent process, well, it needs to be common across all of the documents and all of the contracts. Now, exactly as Jerry said, it needs to be employer-led, and it needs to be something that's forced down, as in the ITER contract. There also needs to be some form of mechanism by which you bring all the different parties into the same process, whether that be into the same DAB referral, or whether you kind of impose, again with ITER, the same DAB members, so that you get this consistency. And third, the decisions of the DAB need to be visible, both to the contract parties to which the decision relates, but also to any future DABs, i.e., you ideally want consistent DAB members who have the ability, kind of in a slightly different context of the usual confidentiality obligations on multi-contracting structures, to be able to see the full project and to understand the issues so that they can use that information in deciding any future disputes in a consistent manner. So, as we said, it needs to be employer-led, and in practice, it means that the employer or some form of kind of standard form organisation like FIDIC needs to arrive at a single consistent dispute resolution clause and needs to make damn sure that that single dispute resolution clause appears in all of the other contracts to which they want it to impact. Goes without saying, if the employer is not on board with the concept of a consistent single DAB process, any contractor, no matter what they negotiate in their own contract, will not be able to make this work. It absolutely needs to be done from the top. And how is it done? Well, the easiest analogy is to think about kind of related dispute clauses that you would see in some of the arbitral rules. And you see these referred to in the context of offshore wind projects as related or sometimes linked disputes. Now, what this is, it's a concept by which different disputes raised by different parties can be brought together, either by consolidating them into the single process, or by kind of forcibly joining other parties into the dispute so that you get the full amount of information coming in, and you also get a consistent decision that can be applied across the project. The typical criteria for whether something is kind of a related or linked dispute is where the dispute is related in its ordinary sense, or where there are common issues of fact or law, or maybe fact and law together, which means that the disputes should be dealt with in a consistent manner. The idea is that it allows parties to be added into the DAB process, which is joinder, or for multiple disputes to be brought within the same process, consolidation, or alternatively, for a direction that the disputes will be heard concurrently by the DAB, so that the decisions arrive with the DAB members having the benefit of having submissions on both of the related or linked disputes, and therefore can ensure that the decisions reached are consistent across the project. So if we're going to have this process, though, I mean, the immediate question is, well, who determines whether a dispute is linked or related? Somebody has to, and there are basically three options. It could be the employer's sole discretion. We see this sometimes, understandably, contractors don't like that, but it's quite an efficient way of doing it. Alternatively, which is the version we see the most, it's at the employer or the contractor's request. So the employer or the contractor, when raising a dispute, has the ability to request that that dispute be termed a related or linked dispute, and to request that it is consolidated or a party is joined into it. Now, if the employer and contractor are unable to agree on that, then the ultimate option is for the DAB itself to be able to determine as a separate dispute whether the different disputes should be determined as a linked or related dispute. That is a kind of backstop, really, to allow this whole process to work. But if you're going to rely on it, again, you need to ensure that all the contractual provisions in the different contracts confer that authority onto the DAB so that they're able to make that decision. So what are we talked a little bit about the advantages. What are the practical difficulties of achieving this kind of multi-party DAB process in offshore wind? Well, first of all, there's that residual reluctance from employers who don't always want DABs, particularly standing DABs, to be the default. You know, we see this quite a lot still, with DABs becoming optional at the employer's request, and I'll get onto some of the ways we see this in the market a bit later on. Obviously, to work, it requires the parties to actually raise their dispute formally and not just do a deal behind the scenes. You know, as you will all know, no doubt being involved in the offshore wind industry, there are certain big players who are repeat customers, repeat contractors, repeat clients. Not everybody wants to raise a dispute formally, and often they do want to just do a deal on future projects and things. The problem is that this transparency falls down where disputes are not properly referred, because the DAB simply does not understand what is going on in the project. Obviously, with a standing DAB, some of those issues can be alleviated, but it's something to bear in mind. Also, if you're labeling disputes as being linked or related, and that labeling then sticks not only to the DAB referral, but also to any later kind of escalation of that dispute, then that could potentially bind parties into, you know, much larger, more expensive proceedings, potentially against their will. You know, in particular, it's one thing, as everybody knows, it's one thing referring something to a DAB and getting a quick decision. It's something else having that same dispute heard in arbitration, which can take much, much longer and obviously cost a great deal more. Although that concern can be slightly moot in that these concepts of joinder and consolidation are already seen in arbitration clauses, and employers will typically insist on that. So I think that is a concern that we hear a lot, but there may not be too much in it. Other practical difficulties, well, there's the kind of perennial one in multi-party contracting structures, which is you may want to run different arguments in different disputes against different parties, and having everything suddenly made transparent may restrict your ability to do so. Query whether that's actually a good thing. And then obviously who chooses the DAB members? As Murray was saying, the ITA program kind of forces them, imposes them from the top down. That is generally the easiest way to do it. Becomes very complicated once you start trying to include everybody in it. That said, you know, with a sophisticated employer and a big project, there's certainly scope to have the parties try and reach agreement. The issue around that is timing. And that brings me on to the final point on this slide, which is if you don't have a standing DAB agreed at the outset with an execution of the relevant agreements, is it simply going to give rise further down the line to issues around jurisdiction when you have so many different parties? And in this context, on a multi-party dispute, there's an argument, and I'd be very interested to hear people's views on this, but there's an argument to say that signing an agreement regarding the DAB's appointment and jurisdiction right from the very beginning with the contracts might be a good way of operating, because it would remove a lot of that friction further down the line. We've also got the perennial problem around who's going to cover the running costs. In a normal kind of two-party contract, you would just split those costs equally. Here, you've got lots of different contractors with different packages and different contract values who may have different ideas, and that's again a kind of foundational issue that needs to be given thought at the beginning. So how is this being dealt with in the market? Well, there's a couple of different ways. First of all, one of the most straightforward ways is simply aligning the DAB process with the wider arbitration provisions, i.e. reflecting those concepts of joinder and consolidation across both levels. That's unusual, but it is quite a simple way of dealing with it. What we see a bit more, though, is the second option, which is there's no standing DAB, but there is a process by which a dispute is escalated to some form of committee of the different contracting parties, who then determine by agreement how that dispute is to be dealt with one of the options being a reference to a DAB set up for that purpose, and then the terms of that referral, again, being subject to agreement between the parties. Slightly clunky, gives rise to lots of issues if parties are not interested in doing that, but that tends to be how we see it at the moment in this market. The other solution, which is an obvious one, is for this to be adopted in standard forms. Now, FIDIC is busy working on a new offshore standard form right now. I have had a bit of a conversation with some of the committee members working on that standard form. I would like to say that they're thinking along all the same lines as us on this call today. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. So there's a lot of scope for advocacy among industry members here to try and get people to adopt some kind of workable multi-party DAB process for the industry, because there are lots of quite obvious benefits. So with that, I'll hand over from my session, but yeah, please do raise questions at the end. I'd be very interested in dealing with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Aaron, if you please.
Was Nick first, actually? No. Okay, then it's me. Tom, when you stop sharing, then I can share mine. Thank you very much. Am I sharing now, Georgiana?
Not yet.
Okay, then it should be this one.
Okay, now it is.
Okay, many thanks. Okay, I'm taking over here with a concrete project. It's the TenneT 2 gigawatt program on the North Sea. TenneT is the Dutch transmission systems operator. It's the only one in the Netherlands, and it also provides grid, high voltage grid to 1/3 of Germany. So the client base, the number of consumers being touched by what TenneT does is 43 million, and I believe the total length of the grid is about 25,000 kilometers. As you all are aware, there's a huge transition underway in Europe, transforming energy landscape. By the way, the graphs in this presentation are thankfully taken from a study by Arthur D. Little and by TenneT about this particular program, which we're about to discuss. And as you can see, the consolidated aggregated growth rate of renewable energy production in the coming years, and the countries mentioned, is huge. So lots of investments need to be done to accommodate this, and therefore, at least in the Netherlands and also in Germany, there's lots of new wind parks being developed on the continental shelves of both North Sea continental shelves, both of the Netherlands and then Germany. And a system like that looks as follows. I don't know whether you can see my arrow, but these are obviously the wind parks. There's a sea cable which comes in at alternating current. However, the enormous length of these of distances of these wind parks to the shore is so much that the alternating current needs to be transferred into direct current, which then goes to a sea cable to the converter station on the land, where it will be connected to the extra high voltage grids. So in this regard, TenneT was commissioned to build 13 high voltage direct current offshore grid connection systems with a transmission capacity of 2 gigawatt each, each one serving as a kind of a wall connector for 2 wind parks of a little less than 1 gigawatt per wind park, both on the German and the Dutch continental shelf, and that needs to be finished by 2031. It's an investment of, well, between 25 and 30 billion euros. And in this respect, TenneT will be able to supply up to 35 million households with green wind energy from the North Sea, which will then deliver a capacity of 28 gigawatt, which is about 30% of the EU's 2030 offshore expansion targets, and reduce environmental impacts by up to 50% through the higher transmission capacity per system. So how is this going to be done? There's only a small number of manufacturers and suppliers of the systems which are required in order to build this. Obviously, there's the offshore subsea system, which is comparable to offshore platforms. But then there's this yellow box, which is actually a black box, at least in terms of technology. And the whole idea is to close, and this also has been done, both for the cable and for the offshore stations in each portfolio contract, because there will be in total 7 portfolio contracts, 3 for the offshore stations and 4 for the cables. But the idea is to design one and then build many. So to learn from one and then expand it to several others. As you can see here, the dimensions of these stations are enormous. These are complete flat or apartment buildings, so huge, but then on sea. However, it's nice to have these sorts of aspirations, but there are shortages in the supply chain. So TenneT wants to pose itself as a very nice, a very popular, a very comforting sort of employer for which the industry is really ready to open its windows and to make sure that the required expansion can be realized. And here you see a graph in which you can see that shortly, if nothing happens, the chain scarcities in supply, both for cables as for the stations, will exceed the demand. So what has TenneT done? It thought that it might be a good idea to tender for framework development agreements. And actually, I'm going to the next slide first. Framework development agreements for what they call portfolios. Like I said, 3 for offshore stations and 4 for cables. And under each frame development agreement, there will be a number of FIDIC yellow type supply design build contracts agreed. But what makes it different from a regular FIDIC contract? The contracts itself are not that different. They're a little bit, they're based on the 2017 Yellow Book standard form, but the overriding framework development agreement has characteristics of both partnering agreements and alliancing agreements. There are joint objectives, alliancing principles like best for project, open book, pain gain sharing. There are joint collaboration principles, and on each of the framework levels, there are dispute avoidance boards, which then will serve both on the framework level, dispute avoidance and adjudication board, which on the framework level actually serve as a moderating source, because there will not be that or perhaps no disputes under the framework agreements, except for the ones where disputes which have to do with the speed in which these projects will be granted under the framework level or framework development agreements, and they will be extended into each of the DABs for each separate project. And by doing so, what TenneT wants to achieve is to establish a new culture. So lots of efforts are going into the training of all these project organizations. The joint objectives need to create joint objectives in a win-win sort of atmosphere. There's, like I said, there's lots of investment in training and partnering sort of exercises. Also establishing personal relationships to get to know each other, to build trust on a personal level between the involved parties, and act as one team, cooperation. And by doing so, TenneT had hoped, and actually it has been very successful, because each of those contracts, these framework development agreements, have already been tendered. So by doing so, and it's a little bit different than the type of contracts we have been discussing thus far, multi-chain, because this is only on the supplier level, the supplier being the main contractor is then responsible itself to push through these various principles and ideas, and maybe also dispute resolution solutions into their supply chain. But I must confess that I'm really not aware whether that had been done already. So my focus is only on framework and then in relation to the various FIDIC type contracts. By doing so, TenneT poses itself as a very friendly sort of and an open and a risk-averse, at least risk-averse thinking with the suppliers. So taking risk away from the suppliers, because lots of risks already have been taken on in these contracts by TenneT, and I even believe there's a kind of cost-plus arrangement for at least the first platforms to be built. And this is actually the story I was going to tell about TenneT's program, which brings us exactly at the whole hour. Georgiana, I give the floor back to you.
That's very good. Thank you. Don't worry about the time. Our participants are welcome to stay online, or if the time does not allow for them, the recording will be available on the DRBF YouTube channel afterwards. But I would like to invite Nick now, who has prepared a couple of questions for you until we get to the audience ones. Thank you, Nick.
Yes, thank you, Georgiana. So question first to Tom. I don't believe we've seen interface agreements in the offshore wind sector. If we see multi-contract DBs developing, as has been part of our discussion this afternoon, do you think that that might change and that interface agreements could be a potential route by which we see them?
I think potentially an interface agreement provides a good kind of framework for implementing a multi-contract DAB, because you can set out more clearly in one document, which obviously every party is then party to, exactly what that interface is. As anyone who's working in the industry knows, at present, that's not how things are done. At present, what happens is there's typically an annex within the employer's requirements that simply has a kind of interface schedule and lists how that particular contractor's work interface with everybody else. And there is a generic obligation within the individual contract signed with the employer that says it is for the contractor to manage the interface and to properly coordinate with the other contractors on site. And that is left as it is. That gives the employer quite a lot of leeway in terms of saying what is and isn't an interface risk and what are and are not, or should not be, claims against particular contractors. So at the moment, do I think an interface agreement is a good idea? Yes. Do I think employers are likely to jump at the opportunity right now? No, because the current structure actually gives them a bit of an advantage in terms of how they run those contracts.
Thanks, Tom. And a question, I've got a question coming up from Murray, which is in the chat, but a question for Jerry first. How do you see DRBF WFO potentially taking the discussion forward that we've had this afternoon? If it were your choice, of course.
Yes. Thank you, Nick. I mean, to borrow a phrase from Tom, I think there's plenty of scope for advocacy here with the benefits of multiple contract DABs and with the membership of the DRBF, you know, with participants from a dispute board background, be it dispute board practitioners or lawyers or contractors involved in dispute board work. Coupled with the membership of the WFO in terms of all the players and runners and riders from the offshore wind industry, I think that's a very useful platform for advocacy, be it with the standard forms of contract drafters, FIDIC or otherwise, be it with the financiers, project financiers want their project to be delivered, you know, as quickly as possible. They don't want to be wasting time in costly and time-consuming disputes. They want the infrastructure commissioned so they get a return on their investment. So I think there's real scope for advocacy there. We've had some fantastic ideas brought to the table today. I think maybe a market sounding exercise would be the next step, and then take it forward from there, Nick, would be my idea.
Okay. Anybody else in the panel like to chip in on that question?
Well, I think Jerry's right. I think as the DRBF, maybe we need to get out there and certainly try and reach more employers and more contractors. As I say, despite I think the skepticism maybe in this industry about interface agreements, they have worked very well on the ITER project. Although I can't divulge the actual wording of those interface agreements, I'm sure that for interested parties, I can certainly put them in touch with the legal team at F4E that put those together. And they have worked very effectively. Certainly in the 12 years that I've been on that panel, we have had 2 disputes. Neither of which triggered the dispute resolution clauses in the interface agreements. They were purely between the employer and two individual consortia. So there's a certain amount of the interface agreement that's a little untested, I guess, at the moment. And indeed, whether or not under the agreement that's in place, you could bring a number of consortia together with the employer, I think that would need to be tested.
And can I maybe chip in as well? I believe that under the old, but I'm not sure whether it's completely correct, the PPC forms, construction excellence, there were so-called project team agreements, which not really our interface agreements, but we try to regulate the collaboration between the various participants in a multi-contract, multi-party construction project, in which I believe there was a joint form of dispute avoidance and resolution clauses.
It might also be worth just briefly touching upon CERN, because they've done something
Yeah.
similar. I was involved with the High Luminosity project, which was two mirror image individual projects, one in Geneva and one in France. Again, what they did there, it's a common employer, common client who imposed the dispute board on the two contractors. They knew who the members were when they were tendering, so they didn't raise any objections. We were also introduced at the design stage. And that's quite an interesting way of doing it. I'm doing another one for CERN at the moment, where again the dispute board is involved at the design stage before the contractor even comes on board. You know, that arrangement has worked. I've been through 3 CERN projects now where they've done that. And this sort of imposition of the board, it may sound as though it goes against the grain with the FIDIC procedures and the appointment procedures. But as I say, it seems to work. I think as long as you choose your panel carefully, and you've got to look ahead to ensure there's no conflicts. But exactly the same thing. So they're using the same DAB for consistency on both contracts.
Well, let's keep that one open, but you've given me an introduction to the question I was going to ask you, Murray, which is how do the contractors find a way of living with the fact they can't object or block a panel member?
Yes, I mean, that's a good point. Well, they are aware of what is happening prior to signing the contract. So, you know, when they're tendering, in the tender documents, both ITA and CERN say these are the DAB members. We've chosen them. These will be the people that you'll be dealing with, we've not actually found that to be a problem. In fact, I asked a couple of the CERN contractors what they thought of it, and they seemed to think it was actually quite a good idea because they were pre-warned of what it was going to be. They were entirely free to accept that or reject that. If they reject that, then of course they couldn't have bid for the project. And it hasn't proved to be a problem.
Okay, good. And a question for Arend. The environment that Tenant are proposing to bring in their approach to managing disputes, can it be considered as multi-contract in terms of them placing a single EPC, or do they contract for the substation, the cable laying, etc., separately?
They do separate contracts for cable laying. At least the main cable to the, of course, there the in-array cables of the wind farm have nothing to do with Tenant, by the way. So it's only one cable.
Yes.
On station. So there's, like I said, 7 contracts for 4 cable suppliers and 3 offshore station suppliers or manufacturers. And the only multi-contract thing in that is that it's one DAB for all the various contracts which will have to be given out under that framework development agreement.
Okay, so it could actually be coming back to Jerry's point, it could be very useful in our advocacy to rely upon that example, perhaps.
And I believe that the person who's responsible within Tenant for dealing with governance, as they call it, Miss Monique Tillison, will be one of the speakers in next week's The Hague conference.
All right, so sign up as soon as you can. I had an email myself only the other day saying places were still available. So
yeah,
we'll
in 1 week time.
Yeah,
next Thursday.
That was an excellent segue, Arend. Well done. Well done. It's a good opportunity, certainly. Yeah.
I got it in.
And now I have another question before I turn back to Georgiana to close. Do you find some major issues regarding individual FIDIC timeline deadlines? Should there be conditions precedent to be fulfilled that affect other contractors? Tom, are you able to pick that one up?
Sure. Well, I see Georgiana's put a hand up to answer the question. Georgiana, did you want to go first? Or am I
Oh,
just...
no, I was.
Sure. So look, I mean, the FIDIC timelines are, I think, quite good in terms of the amount of time they provide. Obviously, if you're in a multi-party situation and you're dragging other parties in, it can be difficult to get everything done within the 84 days. I think that is obvious, and that is particularly clear if you're kicking things off and then having a bit of a fight about what is the scope of the dispute, what's the jurisdiction of the DAB, etc. All of that seems to be eminently overcomable, for want of a better word, through either setting out what happens, a clear process of bringing these different disputes together, or simply the parties being commercial and reasonable and agreeing extensions where necessary. Those FIDIC deadlines are often agreed to be extended by consent. And I think it's generally in most parties' interest to ensure that the process happens in a way that gets a good, and by good, a good result. And by good, I mean something which is an approximation of what the answer would be if you were to take it to arbitration. Otherwise, what's the point of the process? So I think as long as there is flexibility built into the process, I don't really see an issue with the current FIDIC deadlines. And I think you do need that deadline in there, even if it is something which ultimately gets extended. Otherwise, you risk the DAB process turning into an arbitration by another name.
Can I make one point here, perhaps, and also looking forward to the Hague conference, which has as its title, The Power of Dispute Avoidance. The whole clock starts ticking once the engineer's determination is there, isn't it? So if the DAB would have an emphasis, a focus on dispute avoidance and using its powers, for instance, under 21.4, or being involved before the consultation meetings start, that would avoid any clock starting to tick. And there a lot of effort can be put in that particular process, I would say.
I certainly think if I can jump in there, you've hit the nail on the head, Aaron, because both ITER and CERN have actually shortened the FIDIC periods. ITER is 25 days. CERN, I think, is 28 days. So they're actually looking for a shorter period. We've had a couple of disputes on CERN that we have actually done within the 28 days. The two ITER ones, one I think got done shortly after the deadline, which was extended. The other one took a few months because it was much more complicated, and the parties did agree that. But dispute avoidance is a thread that runs through both of those projects from the start. And the aim is always to not get to the point where a formal referral is made. And in that respect, what I've found is the non-binding opinion is a very powerful tool, because a party can contest its case, a party can get an independent, neutral view of a position it may have taken, and if it actually wants to take it further in the future, then there's nothing stopping them from doing that. There's nothing binding on the party. There's nothing binding on the DAB. And certainly where you have all these multiple parties, and you have potentially complex interactions between them, the power of the non-binding opinion, I think, is almost greater than it is in a normal two-party contract. Works very well.
Exactly.
Jerry, you want to come in?
Just very briefly to agree with the points that have been made there by Murray and Aaron. In Ireland, we have a practice known as standing conciliation. It's a kind of a hybrid form of a standing DAB. with the dispute avoidance aspect up front in the normal manner, the time for the decision for the dispute cannot be avoided for there's an actual referral is 42 days. So it's half the period with the FIDIC approach. And to my mind, it does tend to focus minds of parties at the avoidance stage, particularly if you're getting closer as the standing conciliator towards an agreement or towards avoiding the dispute. That 42 days compressed time period does focus minds oftentimes in terms of getting the issue over the line and get the issue resolved in advance of a formal referral. So I very much agree with Murray and Aaron's comments there. Thank you.
Would you like to make any closing comments on that question or any other questions? If not, I'll hand to Georgiana.
Anyone, please? No? Well, this is our second webinar on the theme, and we've seen certain developments since last year, and I guess we're going to have another one next year as soon as we have any new developments or any news about the topic. Meanwhile, I would like to invite you to The Hague, and if I'm not seeing you in The Hague in next week, then don't forget, March is around the corner, and it's our Central Eastern European Conference in Montenegro, isn't it?
Montenegro, I think it is, yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you being here today, and in particular to our speakers for all the contributions and all the interesting things we heard today. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It's a pleasure.